Shalom, I'm Rabbi Michael Panitz, and I'm speaking to you from the pulpit of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia. Tonight is January 13th, 2021. It's a historic day. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed a resolution to impeach the current president. This obviously doesn't happen often in our history. Much of the discussion today in the House of Representatives had to do with incitement to riot. And of course, opinion was divided as to whether the president did or did not incite to riot. A majority felt that he did. I'd like to weigh in to this discussion with a very sober recollection from our Jewish history. This took place just over 25 years ago, quarter of a century ago. And it's a sad story of a political assassination and the role of incitement in that tragedy. I'm referring to the assassination of the Prime Minister of the State of Israel at that time, Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin was a war hero. He had taken part in every campaign for the defense of the State of Israel from its birth through the Six-Day War, where he was the chief of staff, and he was a military hero. After a much more difficult Yom Kippur War, Israelis were looking for a figure they could trust, and they elected him as their prime minister. So he served for a few years in the 1970s, and then he served again in the first part of the 1990s. Very difficult time for Israel. It was facing continued opposition from the Arab world and uprisings from Palestinians. Prime Minister Rabin authorized a very bold compromise for peace. This was known as the Oslo Accord, and it was signed in a ceremony on the White House lawn, September 13th, 1993. Prime Minister of Israel shaking hands with an arch-terrorist. And of course, we were hoping that he would have become an arch-former terrorist. Alas, it didn't work out that way. The part of the story that I want to remind you is that many Israelis felt secure that if anyone could preside over an agreement with an historic enemy, with a terrorist group, it would have been Prime Minister Rabin, who was well known as a champion of Israel's security. Many Israelis felt that way, but many did not. And his critics, essentially from the political right side of the spectrum, politically conservative and religiously orthodox Jewish Israelis, castigated him in the most harsh of terms. There were those who created mannequins of him dressed in Nazi uniforms to say that that's what his concessions are amounting to. In the Orthodox community in Israel were some who openly spoke about how Prime Minister Rabin deserved to die. Now, I had a personal brush with this. In May of 1995, we had a wedding here at Temple Israel. I was officiating at the wedding, and then we went upstairs to our very beautiful social hall, the Brody Auditorium, and I was seated next to one of the distinguished guests of the family, who was a visiting rabbi from Israel. an Orthodox rabbi. And he said with no hesitation at all and no sense of self-doubt at all that, yes, Prime Minister Rabin deserves to die for ceding territory of the Holy Land of Israel. I was aghast. Now, I should add that not every Orthodox Jew felt that way. There was a debate within the Orthodox Jewish community. But these statements that the Prime Minister was a man who deserved to die were circulating more and more widely. On the eve of Yom Kippur, 1995, a mystically inclined rabbi stood outside the Prime Minister's residence and invoked a medieval curse, calling the powers of heaven down upon Yitzhak Rabin that he should die within the month. And about a month later, the Prime Minister was assassinated. A young Orthodox student of law named Yigal Amir felt that he himself was called to be the avenging zealot. He stalked the Prime Minister. He went to a peace rally at which the Prime Minister was speaking. And at the end of the rally, the Prime Minister came down from the dais and Yigal Amir shot him. The injuries proved to be fatal. Very, very sad day in Israel. I was there at the time. I remember the shock. It felt the way I remember it as a little boy when I heard that President Kennedy was shot and killed. National outpouring of grief. Incitement. I witnessed it. I saw it. I saw what it could do. Before I left Israel a few days later, I stood at the freshly turned grave of Prime Minister Rabin and recited very heartfelt, very sad prayers. And so all those thoughts are very much in mind as we contemplate the evil outcome that incitement can produce. Let me conclude by quoting the chaplain of the Senate, the Reverend Barry Black, Rear Admiral Barry Black, distinguished chaplain. On the night of January 6th, already the early morning of January 7th, in the closing prayer after the session of the House of Representatives, which had been interrupted by the insurrectionists and then restarted and finally concluded in the wee hours of the morning, Reverend Black quoted the book of Proverbs, chapter 18, verse 21. And he said that the events of the day remind us that life and death are in the power of the tongue. So true. Life and death are in the power of the tongue. Now, I imagine that Reverend Black was consulting the translations and not the original Hebrew, because the original Hebrew says, Mavet v'chayim biyad halashon. Death and life are in the power of speech, the power of the tongue. First death and then life. Alas, sadly, we have seen death come from the power of the tongue. We saw it in Israel in 1995. We saw it on Capitol Hill just last week. I pray that in the days that follow, we shall see life come from the power of speech. Amen.